Okay, well, good evening, everybody. This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore in Scottsdale, Arizona. And we're really pleased to have Mike Lupica back with us this year to talk about the new Spenser novel, Robert B. Parker's Showdown. And as always, Mike has been kind enough to sign a whole bunch of books for us, which we just received. So I'll put a link in the comments field if you'd like to go ahead and order one. And if you have questions for Mike or Barbara, just type them in, and I'll come back towards the end of the hour and ask some of your questions. So, Barbara, over to you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. For any of you who are wondering what that strange green tub is behind Patrick, the bookstore leaks, and we've had rain over the weekend. So
Uh,
I think
that's
that I think that it's there to catch whatever. I know it just
not
yeah,
super classy, is it? All right.
it just looks so weird. I thought I should explain it. Anyway, I am delighted to talk to Mike. We've talked about Mike's books with James Patterson, Mike's books, Brady and the Parker Estate, and it's always a great treat. Now, before we did this, I realized I went, you can see behind, well, maybe you can't. Which side are they on? I have two Robert Parkers. I'm trying to think, where did I put them? On the shelf behind me, because Bob and I went way back, and so I have my copy of Early Autumn somewhere there behind me. And while I was doing that, this fell out of my bookshelf. And what this is the number three mysterious profile about Robert Parker and Spenser. It's a series that the Mysterious Bookshop on Otto Penzler did, and it's from 2007. And I think the thrust of this, Mike, is how does Spenser do what he does? And they have an interviewer from Harvard, Susan Silverman, sitting there with Spenser. And the interviewer, called Amy, says to him, how do you, anyway. Um, so I like this little part. Um, why did he become a private eye? And what happens here is I fought some Golden Gloves and had some pro fights. And I was looking like a comer, but I also got a football scholarship to Holy Cross. And so I went to play football for a couple of years. I don't know much about football, but what position were you? Strong safety, I said, being Spenser, and I ran back punts. Were you any good? Yeah, but I didn't like being coached and college was boring, so I went back to boxing. Was it boring because it was Catholic? No, I said. It was boring because it was college. You're scornful of college, Amy said. I am, but you've read a lot of books, I'm told. You quote poetry. Self-educated, I said. Remember what I told you about him, Susan said. Were you a good boxer? Not good enough, I said. While I was still fighting, I took the police exam and passed and decided to do that. Were you good at that? No, too many rules. So you quit. I did, I said. I may be unemployable and became a private detective. I nodded. And I thought that was kind of interesting to go into Spenser's backstory. Um, did that say anything to you, or you already knew all that?
I knew it without knowing it. Knowing him, I know how disdainful he was, even having had his gig at Northeastern, that he was a little disdainful of the structure of the college world. But you can tell if you read these books and if you knew him, how literate this man really was. And it's part of the shading of Spenser. It's what makes Spenser so interesting. I love quoting literature through him. I love the fact that, and it's not him showing off, it's just showing you who he is.
Hmm.
And here's this guy who goes through life like an honorable bouncer, righting wrongs, slaying dragons, a knight errant in the modern world, but he also can talk about books and he loves music. I mean, it's really, fortunately we have sort of the same taste in music. So I he loved jazz and I love jazz and he loved the standards, and it just, Barbara, just continues to be a great honor to write these books and write these characters. And I think, I was saying to you before we came on, all of these characters, they're just a part of my permanent DNA. They have been with me for way more than half of my life, and and now to get to write about Spenser and Hawk and Susan and Quirk and Belson and Tony Marcus and Rita Fiore, all of those guys, it's what Patterson says. You don't work at writing, you play at writing, and it's just going upstairs and sitting in this room and closing the door and having these characters come alive again. It's just a blast.
This is frozen up.
I think you're unfrozen now.
Yeah, there I go. I know we've had this weird signal all day. I think it's because there's been.
I think it's the leak. I blame it on the leak, Barbara. It's the leak. It all goes back to the leak. I'm telling you, if I were writing this in a mystery, I'd say, how did the leak start?
Okay. Well, anyway, I think this also reminded me, although of course you and I both knew this, that Bob actually got a PhD from Boston University in 1971, and his thesis was on the private eyes Dashiell Hammett, Raymond Chandler, and Ross MacDonald wrote. And, so he was, well, in fact, he was tapped to write, was it 2 or was it 3 Chandlers for the Chandler estate?
He wrote Poodle Springs, and I forget the title of the other one. I think he wrote 2.
I think it was 2 also, right?
Yeah.
But
yeah.
I mean, so he was, he was well grounded in that whole private eye tradition. One of the things I've loved about Bob, because I read him in real time, being old, I remember when the Godwolf manuscript published was 75, I think, wasn't it?
I think it was a little before that, actually, because I was still at Boston College. I've told you this before.
Maybe it was 73. Tony Hillerman published right around there, and I tend to get them confused. But anyway, the title of the first book, the Godwolf manuscript alone indicates, there's sort of a literary hint in the title of the first Spenser. And Bob would quote poetry. I mean, there was always that kind of literary strain in the books.
Yeah.
Patrick says it was 73. Okay, so the Blessing Way was 1975 then. I tend to get them confused because, they're really seminal books. If you're an aging mystery fan, you can remember reading them when they first published.
He's I walked into a Brentano's, may it rest in peace, on Boylston Street, and there was the Godwolf manuscript, and it was just not like anything I love that genre. I was, by then I had read, I felt like I'd read more Travis McGee's than there were Travis McGee's. So I was drawn to that world. And then here's this guy who's tough and smart and funny, and it was the beginning of everything. And before long, I think in Promised Land, Hawk comes along and he becomes the greatest sidekick. And then he's with Susan Silverman, and who's the greatest love interest, I believe, in the history of books like these. And he wasn't, a lot of the private eyes went from woman to woman, and he really didn't. There was another, there was briefly another woman in his life, but mostly it's been Susan Silverman, who's his love, his conscience, his sounding board, and calls him on his BS too.
Yes, she does. I mean, I really have enjoyed the way you legacy writers have written about Susan. I think, everybody that's written about Susan has, I'm trying to think, they've given her more facets. I'm trying to remember, who is it, or is it the Sonny Randall books where Sonny and Susan are friends, or Sonny's a patient? I can't remember exactly what it is.
That
was you, wasn't it?
Intersected before I started writing Sonny, and then it was too delicious an idea to put these two incredibly smart women in the same room, and so that began the relationship between Sonny and Susan Silverman, which was, again, that was a blast. I loved writing the Sonny books. The Sonny books got me into this world, and then I went from Sonny to Jesse Stone, and then I went from Jesse Stone to Spenser.
I know it's been an interesting rotation. I wish you could write all of them, but here we are. Right. So
Well, if Patterson would give me more time off for good behavior, but
oh, come on. Nobody could give you time off for good behavior. Let's be real.
I do have this wonderful, wonderful relationship with Jim Patterson, which is ongoing and busy and fun. But he loves Spenser. He loves this book. He loves what I've done with it. So that's very pleasing to me too.
Well, of course it is. So this is number 53 in the Spenser universe. And you fortunately have sent me a number of reviews, one of which I had read, but a couple were new to me. Um, and I really love the way this one starts out. Balancing Parker's trademark wit, crisp pacing, and moral gravitas, author Mike Lupica, one of the most versatile scribes working today, proves without a doubt that he understands what makes Spenser with a new story that feels both classic and fresh at the same time. That's a really nice paragraph.
It's from Ryan Stack, who, as you know, with the Real Book Spy, he just loves this world. He writes books of his own, and that's to me that's an extremely meaningful review that I'm very, very grateful for.
It absolutely is. And, you know, I've been talking all year about the fact that podcasters have been taking a lead role in crime fiction, partly because other forms of detection, maybe there are fewer private eyes, whatever, but podcasters have really become a focal point in terms of being investigators. And
Yeah,
the idea of not just podcasters, but even crowdsourcing investigations, bringing in, people. Uh, I don't know if you read John Sanford, but his last book, he played on that, and both Lucas Davenport and Virgil worked a crime in which podcasters descended upon the crime scene, and they hated that, but then they enlisted them. And he started the book by showing us the actual murder. So we knew from the get-go what happened. We knew who was killed, who killed the victim, where it happened, how it happened, the whole 9 yards. And so the book was really about how this kind of crowdsourcing investigation got to the place where the reader was from the very beginning, which I thought was structurally interesting. But I also thought it underlined how, working crimes is changing.
yeah. No, I am not personally a fan of the true crime podcast, but I'm aware of how incredibly popular they
Yeah.
are and how addictive they are to people who are fans of them. But I I'm too busy trying to figure out why the guy just came through the door with a gun, Barbara. Yeah, that's my worldview is a little simpler than that. Or it's I always love the story about Chandler where they asked him about one of the people who died in the big sleep, and they said, "Who killed him?" And he said, "I have no idea."
Yes, no, Chandler, right, right. The movies took on a life of their own. I mean, aside from the books with Chandler, which I've always found interesting. But anyway, my point is that there are podcasters functioning as private eyes.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And so you were looking, however, at a podcaster who has some pretty right-wing views. He's anti-immigration. He's a very controversial figure, and he may be on the verge of getting bigger. There may be some, big media thing going on. And then tell us what
Well,
potentially may happen.
I was interested in writing a novel about a Rogan type. He's not Joe Rogan by any stretch of the he's like the second most popular podcaster after Rogan. Okay, and he fancies himself as being on the front lines of the border war. And he's done shows from the border. He's become the face of that. And all of a sudden, and again, I'm not spoiling anything, at the start of this book, because he really is anti-immigrant. And a young man shows up in the office of Rita Fiore saying that he is his son and that he is the product of a relationship between a former housekeeper of Vic Hale, the podcaster, when his mother was an undocumented immigrant. and which would then fly in the face of everything that he stands for at a time when he is about to sign one of the biggest deals in history. And from there, mischief and mayhem and murder ensue. We do have a podcaster, another podcaster from South Florida, a young man named Ricardo Baez, who sees that Daniel Lopez, the illegitimate son, or so he says, has tremendous potential to take down Vic Hale. And so they form an alliance, and then something happens, and all of a sudden, even though Daniel Lopez isn't quite Spenser's client, he effectively becomes his client as Spenser tries to find the truth about this relationship. Because the kid has grown up believing his father died crossing the river trying to get in to the United States of America. It's a made up story because the mother hasn't told him who his real father is. But the podcaster has been supporting him throughout his life. And the young man finds this separate bank account and these letters after his mother is murdered in South Florida, which kind of becomes part of our story.
It does become part, and in its own way, it's kind of a lost heir plot. I mean, it's a little bit like, the franchise affair, Josephine. No, I'm sorry, not the franchise affair, but it'll come to me, whatever in other words, the young man comes from out of the blue and claims that he's really, the son of the Earl and that kind of thing. And so I really enjoyed that. That's a kind of a nice riff, on a very old plot. The difference, of course, today being that with DNA evidence, you can, be more assured in discovering whether the quote lost heir is actually the lost heir.
Well,
So,
and the Spenser's relationship with this guy who he's never met is complicated by the fact that he's extremely loyal to Vic Hale's late father, with whom Spenser had boxed way back in the day, and who had saved Spenser's life in an alley fight one night. So he feels beholden to him, and it's the only reason why he would give this guy the time of day. But their relationship becomes complicated, and it's you've heard me say this before. I don't consider myself to be a real tricky plotter. I'm from the Elmore Leonard school of get them in a room, start them talking, and something interesting will develop. But this to me is actually a pretty tricky plot. And,
yeah.
And I always love it when the reviewers say rip from the headlines. I like that. Rip from the headlines. Sound very dramatic.
Come on, you're a journalist of, decades standing. So, it doesn't seem to be an entirely unfair comment. But
And you know what, Barbara? When I started this book, I didn't know how hot a topic this actually would become.
well, I was going to say, yeah, I think circumstances have worked in your favor in terms of making this,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, not, way back. Do you remember in early autumn when, Spenser is looking after this young man and Bob, who had two sons, well, one of them anyway was gay. I can't remember if both of them were, but
Both.
certainly,
Both. Yeah.
yeah, I
Both.
think so.
Both. Yeah.
And so Bob was one of the early people who actually wrote about that, Spenser taking up with, there was
Oh
other,
my God! Spike in the Sonny Randall movie books is
yeah,
I described him when I took him over as a gay superhero. Oh no, he wrote on that subject with such intelligence and such compassion.
he did.
And again, this for anybody who hasn't read the Sonny books, Allison Galen's writing them now. I wrote them, and Spike is a central figure. I mean, you could tell how much Bob loved writing Spike.
Yes, you absolutely could. But if you look back to looking for Rachel Wallace, for example,
Yep. Yep.
she was a lesbian, and the boy in early autumn, whose name I can't remember, was a young man that I always thought that Bob kind of thought about his own boys and how he would feel about, one of them being in a difficult
Yeah, yeah.
situation like that.
Paul Giacomin is not gay in the books, but their relationship is as close as Bob ever had to having Spenser have a son in these books. I've actually maybe not in the one I'm writing, but I want to bring him back because I love that character. The bond that was forged between him and that young man who came from a troubled, obviously a troubled
Okay.
household.
For some reason, I remember him as being gay, but I
No,
believe you
no,
that he was
no,
not. Okay,
no,
so
he's not.
maybe did he write it right after Rachel Wallace or right before? Didn't they sort of
I
come
think
together?
early autumn was after Rachel Wallace. I'd
So
have to
maybe
look.
maybe that's why I was sort of, well, I can tell. I can look here in the
Wait a
Spenser
minute, I've got
profile.
it right here. No, listen, I don't want you to, don't
It
you?
was Rachel Wallace is 1980 and early autumn was 1981. So maybe that just kind of bled over when I was reading them.
Rachel Wallace is a great character. Finding
Yeah,
Rachel Wallace, there is the climax of that book, um, when he basically walks to the suburbs in a blizzard because he can't get there by car to save Rachel Wallace is it's just one of the great sequences that Bob ever wrote.
he did. He wrote some marvelous ones. So, and we're talking about the media and all. And I think in this review from Ryan Seck, I really like this comment. At the same time, the modern backdrop for this story, filled with media manipulation, personal branding, and public outrage, makes the story feel utterly of the moment. And I think that's one of the things about Spenser that, I mean, just think this is the 53rd book, and it started back in, 1973, and yet you can make it of the moment. You can make a story that is entirely relevant to where we are at the moment out of these characters.
Yeah, Spencer doesn't do any soapboxing about Vic Hale's politics. He really doesn't. I mean, Susan finds him more odious than Spencer does. The guy just annoys him. And you know that never ends well. If you annoy Spencer, no good can come of
Yep.
that for you.
No.
And so he knows he owes it to this young man to find the truth. And then it's, you've read the book, there's DNA tests and nurses and stuff and a hospital that is now gone. And it's the resolution of it. I'm extremely pleased if people will stay with this book, which I think they will. The resolution, I think, is they will find quite interesting and quite satisfying because there's an ending and then there's another ending that you kind of don't see coming. And without spoiling the book, there's a hero that you don't see coming, um, uh, uh, who kind of takes down the bad guy in the end.
So, pointing out your writing process, did you see the hero coming, even if the reader doesn't?
No, no, no. I became, again, I don't want to spoil this book, but you know who I'm talking about.
Yep.
He became, he's one of those characters that walked into the book, looks adversarial, and then turns out he became more and more interesting to me, more and more fun to write. And if to use a baseball analogy, Barbara, I bring him out of the bullpen for the ninth
Right.
inning. That's what I
No,
did.
I totally get it. But I think I was just interested in, whether it always seems when something works so well to a reader that you must have seen it from the beginning, that the author
No,
must have. And it's always surprising when the author says, no, it just sort of happened in telling the story.
no, working with Jim, you've heard me say this before. Jim is a bear for outlines, okay, and which provide a tremendous, roadmap for both of us. But once we get going, we don't stick to it, but we kind of keep the car on the road, and but the fun of doing this kind of book, the fun of doing any kind of book, is when it surprises you, and I think you've heard me say this before. One of my favorite quotes about writing comes from Alan Bennett. Wrote The Madness of King George and The History Boys, but The Lady in the Van. It's fabulous. He's about 90 or 91 now. And he once said, the fun of writing is finding out that you know things that you didn't know you knew. And there's nothing more exciting than, and I've told you this, I write longhand before I type it into my laptop. I use these yellow pieces of paper with unlined, because Dutch Leonard told me don't use lined paper. You're worrying too much about it. So now I have these blank pieces of page. But there's nothing more exciting than literally feeling the pen in your hand and seeing something happen that you did not know was going to happen. And at that point, you feel like you're one of your own readers, because all you want to do as a writer is keep people to turn pages to find out what's going to happen next. Okay.
Mhm.
But then when you experience that, when you're writing the book, I just sit back sometimes and I say, okay, this really is the best job in the whole wide world.
Well, that reminds me of things that in this little interview that Spenser says, because they ask, is he never afraid? Well, sure he is, but he just goes on. And I think that's interesting. You've always struck me as a fearless writer in the sense that you have confidence that is all going to work. But then
Yeah.
you had years writing, in journalism and so forth before you really took up this novelist gig on a full-time basis. So you don't lack confidence, even if you don't know exactly where you're going. I think you strike me as somebody who knows he'll get to the end.
Yeah. Does it always come out perfectly? No, of course it doesn't. Not for any of us. I could pick up, I got a bunch of my books behind me here. I could go into any one of those books, Barbara, and I guarantee you there won't be a page where I look at a phrase or a sentence or a quote and say, oh man, if I could have just gone back at that one more
Right.
time. It's why when we're in the editing process, I have a great editor with the Jim and I have a fabulous editor named Denise Roy, and Tom Colgan is now my editor at Putnam. And there comes a point where they just have to, wrestle the book away, because I will be trying to fix it to the last possible moment. But you have to surprise yourself. I mean, Elmore Leonard always said that he wrote to please himself.
Mhm.
And there is, I feel the same way, but when I see the response I have gotten from the Parker sphere, okay, for Sonny and Jesse and for Spenser, I I'm one of them, okay? No one was a more passionate fan of these books than I was. I remember how excited I was when I realized that when I saw the first Jesse Stone, I didn't even know it was coming. And I said, oh my God, now he's got another character. And then along comes Sonny Randall. And then he was doing the Westerns. And again, if I had the time, I would do all three. I'd still do all three, because I loved every one of those experiences. But I always felt like from the time, I wrote Sonny, and I had a feeling that Ace Atkins, who did such a great job with Spenser,
Mhm.
wasn't going to do it forever. So I always felt like that was going to be in play for me at some point. And when the moment came, I felt like I was ready for it. But to have been embraced, not just by the reviewers, but by Parker fans, and I want to say to all of them, we are the same. I'm one of you. I wasn't going to screw this up, because first of all, he was my friend and I knew him. And you've heard me say this also before, Barbara. I think Bob would be very pleased with the Spenser books. I think he'd be very, very pleased.
Oh, I do too. Absolutely. There was nothing precious about Bob. Never. I mean, he was a working writer. And he loved it. Otherwise, he wouldn't have kept, inventing new characters and going on. I mean, Bob wrote until he couldn't write anymore. He died, he died so quickly. There
He
was no
died at his desk. He died at his desk, and
right.
and it was like finding out that Superman had died. I can remember Mike Barnacle, our mutual friend, had called me up. He said Parker died, and I said no. It's like if you're a basketball fan, it'd been like hearing that Wilt Chamberlain died. When he
Yeah.
died, it was beyond. He was just he. It sounds like a cliche, but you knew him and I knew him. He was big. The guy was bigger than life. He was just, everything about him was robust. Whether it was his passion for Joan, or his passion for baseball, or his passion for his work. One of the most fun days I ever had with him. I was in town. I forget why I was in town for something, and Mike Barnacle had a morning radio show in Boston at that time, and Bob was on that morning, and we didn't, we didn't know that we were going to intersect. And somewhere, there's a tape of about 90 minutes of us, and it was like, if you ever heard it, it was like you were sitting with the bad kids in the back of the class, and he was just so much damn fun to have dinner with or just be around.
He was. Now I can still see him sitting up there in front of all the fans in the bookstore and smiling at everybody and saying, "You can call me Grandmaster Bob." I mean, I still remember that. Yeah, I mean, people really flocked to him, but in a way, I was grateful that he didn't have to suffer, a long decline. I mean, he
Yeah,
was here and then he died. And, that I thought for Bob, that was the right exit.
he was. Every once in a while I'll go back and look at some in my somewhere on the cloud. I have a lot of our email exchanges, mostly about baseball,
Sure.
but um, it was again when I got the call to write my first Sonny. I sat down. I was up in Vermont, and my daughter was a champion show rider, and she was competing up there. We had a rented house, so we were up there for about 3 weeks. And I sat down that morning to just write a sample chapter for Ivan Held, who I call the capo di tutti capo, Putnam, the boss of all bosses. And the minute I started writing this first scene with Sonny Randall and Spike, I just felt I was exactly where I was supposed to be, where in an odd way, maybe I had been moving towards from the time I did pull a paperback copy of the Godwolf manuscript off that shelf that day.
Well, you came to see us with that book, and I told you how much I loved it, like seeing, Sonny back. And, let's talk for a moment about the satellite characters in Spenser, because it isn't just Spenser that we love, it's the whole thing. Now, you know, I've had writers say that at some point in a series, you have to kill off somebody meaningful, or, there's no real point in it. And I was really worried in your last book when Rita Fury is shot, and this is a spoiler. But I was really worried you decided that Rita was going to be that sacrifice, that we had to sort of keep the reader on edge.
No,
Will
you have to,
everybody?
Barbara. Jim Patterson says all the time, the reader has to believe that no one is safe. Okay. And
Right.
so Rita didn't die, but she nearly died. And that book, I had started in a different way. I'd started in a different way, and I was on a different path. I knew that I wanted a George Santos like character in the book, which there became. And then I said, no, no, Rita's going to face death, and because I needed that book to start with something that was intensely personal, like
Yeah.
intensely personal, and it's the momentum that drives that book. And all I can tell you about the one I am writing now is there is a beloved character who is in a world of hurt and a world of trouble, and shockingly, Barbara, you're not going to believe this, has nowhere to turn except to Spenser.
Oh no. I love it. So that means that book number 54 is actually going to appear since
No, it's being written, and I wish I could tell you who that character is, but
no, no,
you're
no,
you're
no,
gonna
no. I
say,
want
but
to
when
be
you find out who it is, you're gonna say, no, no, not him. I'll
I
just tell you
want to
that.
read it as though I don't know anything about it. I have, over the course of the years, Bob's books were always kind of slim. I can't reach behind me at the moment, but the early autumn, and they're small books, right?
No, they were thin until
Yeah, he didn't. Bob did not waste words. He never did.
I
And
think, Barbara, I think first the first fat one, I think, was it the Catskill Eagle? It's the one where he has to go rescue Hawk in San Francisco, and Susan has run away with another
yeah,
guy who won't let. Is that the Catskill Eagle? I think it is.
might
And
be.
then the books, they got a little, using the word robust again, they got a little more robust, and he, he was working towards the one of his that was my favorite was Cold Service.
Okay.
That was, to me, I've read that one and reread it and listened to Joe Mantegna. Blessedly, he is still doing the audiobooks, and he sounds the way Spenser ought to sound. But Cold Service, for anybody who hadn't read it, after you read Showdown, of course, it starts with Hawk getting shot in the back, talking about
Right.
nobody being safe, and he's hovering between life and death at the beginning, and then it becomes, a play off of revenge is a dish best served cold.
Well, I don't know that when you say they're more robust, it was that Bob was necessarily, I mean, he did probably write them larger, but a lot of it was just the production, because books went from being like 10 inches to 12 inches, and the margins got wider and all those good things. But anyway, my point is that no matter how much I had to do, no matter how harassed I was, minute a Spenser came in, it would be my treat. And I would
Oh,
say to myself, if I just get this task and this task done, then I can sit down with Bob. It was absolutely always guaranteed that it was going to be so wonderful to read, Rita
you're
Parker.
preaching to the choir, Barbara. When
Oh,
I would
yeah.
walk into a bookstore, I didn't know what the publishing schedule was. Okay, I didn't know what his time of the year was. Walking into a Barnes and Noble on Fifth Avenue in New York City and seeing a new Spenser, it was like it was. You felt like it was opening day of the baseball season. It made me feel like a kid all over again. And then I would open these books, and I would be as excited as I was when I read the first one.
Well, absolutely. In other words, Bob was always guaranteed enjoyment.
Oh,
Even, it didn't matter where he went. See, my favorite book is the third one, the baseball book. I've always
oh,
loved
Mortal Stakes is great.
Mortal Stakes is still my favorite because I could not imagine how he was ever going to bring it off. I mean, if you recall, it was just an impossible plot. And
Yes,
I thought there is no way that Bob is going to be able to make this book work. And then magically he did.
he did. It was like a locked room mystery, except in
Yeah.
this case, the locked room was Fenway Park.
Exactly. And some years ago, when I was in Boston at the end of a cruise, we were staying at the Harbor House Hotel down there on the water.
Yeah,
And my daughter overheard the concierge getting somebody tickets to the game that night. And so she kind of lit up, being a baseball fan. And she looked at me and said, Mom, she said, you'd probably rather do something else, but, why don't we go to Fenway? I said, of course we're going to go to Fenway, yay. I mean, I have to go and see one game with the Green Monster, but I can also relive Mortal Stakes if I'm sitting there
a
in Fenway.
really good book. It's hard, coming from that world, and I'm still writing 2 columns a week for the Daily News just for the pure fun of it.
Yeah.
It's hard to fictionalize a real baseball team.
Yes,
With
it is.
it's a very tricky thing to be able to do. Now, when I reference the Red Sox, I reference real players now. I'm not smart enough. So he's talking about Mookie Betts and he's talking about Rafael Devers, and Hawk is making fun of him for still being in mourning because Mookie Betts got traded. It's so I have grounded it in the real world of his beloved Red Sox.
Right. Well, anyway, we could go on and on about Bob. And we can't say a whole lot more without big spoilers for Showdown, but I think we emphasized in this conversation is classic Parker, but yet it's totally contemporary. And I think, for a PI that started as a Korean War veteran and is still in 2025,
He keeps himself up, Barbara. That's all. I'll just
yeah,
say that.
I know. Well, we all, excuse me, all of us are complicit in the plot of of just, everybody's aging, but the people in the book,
Everybody does it, as you know. I mean, this is, this is like the mothership of books like these, Poison
yeah,
Pen. Everybody does it differently. Harry Bosch is aging in real time by the great Michael Connelly. Oh my God, The Proving Ground is,
I know. I
oh
just
my God.
finished it.
No, I've been, texting and emailing. The Proving Ground is like a master class. Okay. But Bosch, Mickey, it's different with Mickey Haller. He is who he is. But Bosch is aging in real time. John Rebus is aging in real time, and fortunately, we have found it's probably in the public garden in Boston, Barbara. I can't tell people where it is. Spenser has found the fountain of youth. And thank God that he has, because there are more dragons to slay. There are more wrongs to be righted. And he's got to get a date with Susan Silverman for dinner at one of these restaurants that I love writing about.
Yes, you do. I know. I've been a beneficiary, excuse me, of one of them. And yet, what's interesting is that Boston has changed. Boston is not entirely the Boston, that Bob was earlier. Some of the restaurants are gone. There have been, I mean, it's an old city and the basic framework has stayed the same. But within it, businesses come and go.
Oh,
So
Barbara,
you can't
I
even
want
walk over anymore.
I have spent an unbelievable amount of my life in Boston, Massachusetts. I went to Boston College. All four of my children went to Boston College. My sister went there. Her oldest son went there. And so that city, people say, "How's a New York guy write about Boston?" I said, "No, no, no, no. You don't have any idea how much time I have
Right.
spent in that city." But I can remember when I first went to BC. I'll tell you one thing about Boston. There was the old Ritz, and there weren't many great hotels there. Now it's a fabulous hotel town. I
That's
mean,
right.
from the harbor to the this to the that. It's the old Ritz became the Taj, and then it became I forget what it's called now, but it's in that way that, and the restaurant business has become extremely vibrant. And you're right,
Yes.
Lockover is long gone. I think Anthony's Pier 4. I'd have to check. I think Anthony's Pier 4, where my pop and my mom used to take me when it was a special occasion. No, but I'll tell you what, it's an extremely interesting and dramatic city
Oh,
to
it
write
absolutely
about.
is. But what I'm saying is that while these characters are ageless, you are updating Boston. I mean, I like the map of the city, I like Spenser where his office is, all those good things. So I find it sort of fun that the city is evolving in time, but the characters are, and they're evolving too, but they are not aging.
No, it's the one big change I had to make when Ace passed the baton. He had moved Spenser over and I said, no, he's coming back to the Back
Yeah,
Bay.
no, I agree.
And
And I do think having the map in the book is very helpful.
yeah, his geography, it's great. It's
Yeah,
great. It's embedded.
here's what we're talking
Yeah,
about in the
yeah.
book. There
I'm
is,
so happy we do that all the time now.
yeah,
And,
I am
and
too. I think, and even though, you'd think I would know it all by heart, um, it's still it's still very helpful to kind of take a look. Susan's home way up here. And actually, and I've been to Boston various times, but the last time I was there, trying to remember, it's like a year ago, September or something. I had never actually gone to Harvard. And I felt
really,
like, no, well, there wasn't any reason to, I mean, I was doing Boston and all, and, I'm a Stanford girl, so, I didn't have any particular nostalgia.
congratulations on your fine victory over Cal, by the way.
Oh, thank you very much.
You got the
Yeah.
Cal coach fired. I hope you're happy.
Well, that is a long, long rivalry, that is, I mean, it was going strong in the 50s and probably still. Anyway, so that part of the geography of Boston I was not familiar with because I hadn't done that before, but we went to the Fine Arts Museum to see, I can't remember what it was. And then um, I said to Rob, why don't we cross the river? Why don't we go to Cambridge and see what's over there? We could visit the library, the whole bit. And it was a really great experience. But um, I now have that geography in my head in a way that I did not have before.
You should have gone over to the famous house that Bob and Joan.
I have done that. I just hadn't gone to Harvard.
Okay.
I
Yeah.
mean, the actual Harvard campus, and hilariously, there, we wandered around that, and then was it the Fog Museum? There's a couple of museums there, and one of them you go in, and it was an art museum that has a big kind of a central courtyard, and then
Yeah.
there were some small rooms around the side, and they were laying down all this white paper across the entire floor of the atrium. And I mean, they had earnest looking young women, with long hair, the whole bit, and they are smoothing out all this paper and taping it down. And, we wondered what was going on. And then somebody handed us a flyer, and it was like 3:40 or something. And at 4 o'clock, some famous Chinese calligrapher is going to drop in, and he is going to do calligraphy on this white paper. He's going to write a poem or something. And, there were like 8 people around the atrium and
Right.
all. And I thought, I'm telling you, at 4 o'clock, it was mobbed. There were people up on balconies there, and Rob looked at me and he said, only at Harvard on Friday afternoon, at like 4:40 or something by the time we got there, which you get a crowd assembling for something that's esoteric. And then hilariously, we went on to New York, and I am walking on the second floor of the Metropolitan Museum, where the big staircase is, back towards the Chinese exhibit. And there he is, the calligrapher, right in front of
Really?
me.
No kidding.
It was so funny. But I did realize, that there was a special kind of a thing about Harvard that until you go there, I think it's hard to really kind of grasp. I
No,
think you
Cambridge is great.
actually
Harvard
be there.
Square is great. I'll tell you
Yeah.
what, you want to experience Boston, go there on Marathon Monday sometimes. That
Oh,
is,
wow.
which is like the New Year's Eve of Boston. And that's why when they bombed the finish line that year,
Yeah.
I was on my way there the next morning because that struck the heart of the city, because anybody who knows anything about Boston knows how important that day was, and that those guys had blown up the finish line and
Yeah.
killed people. And our youngest son was still at Boston College. The city went into lockdown. That
Yeah.
was extremely, extremely personal for all of us who love Boston.
I'm sure it was. Well, it's a glorious city, and I do think that, one can't really imagine Spenser out of it. I mean, he's, not a private eye that could just relocate to Philadelphia or something of the sort. And part of the magic of the Spenser books, in fact, is just the magic of Boston.
Yep. Boston is a character in these books
Mm.
the way Los Angeles is a character in my pal, the great Robert Crace's Elvis Joe Pike books.
Yeah.
It's that city. He brilliantly evokes the heart and soul and personality of that city, and I hope that people who have taken to my Spenser books can see that I have the same feeling about that city.
You do. Absolutely. Well, my dear, it's always a great pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for signing books again.
Of
Um,
course, of course.
So interestingly, publishing has moved towards publishing books during Thanksgiving week, which is a relatively new wrinkle for publishing, but partly because the schedule is so crowded. But anyway, we do have autographed copies. You can drop in
No,
to
I
grab
do my
yours.
usual double this week. I do the Poison Pen on Monday night. I'll be appearing on Morning Joe tomorrow to talk about Showdown, and then I think we've got 16 for Thanksgiving dinner.
Are you personally cooking?
Oh no,
Yeah,
no,
right.
no! Spenser would cook. Spenser would
Spenser
cook.
Spenser would definitely cook,
No,
right?
these are novels, but I make things up.
Yeah. No,
I
I
know.
understand that, but it's an interesting week. But I do think as an interesting publication date, it was always right after Thanksgiving when
Right,
Ace wrote them,
right.
and so um,
Well, you know what? You know what the great symbolism is? Pub date is tomorrow officially,
right.
and it's my daughter's birthday. So I think that's an
Oh,
extremely good omen. As by the way, Barbara, the celebration of this birthday is starting to take on aspects of Mardi Gras. There was a dinner. There was a dinner last night. There'll be a party at our home downstairs tomorrow.
Okay.
Thanksgiving, of course, will be a de facto third birthday party celebration. Right. And there, at this point, I have to tell you, there's no end in sight.
Oh, that's what happens when you're a great dad. And, you know, and Bob Parker really was a great dad. He was a wonderful author, but I've always thought that he was a terrific father, so proud of his boys. I assume that you do see them or hear from them since you are writing for the Parker estate.
Yeah, David is the one that I've had. I've not met Daniel in any way, shape, or form.
Really?
And Joan, obviously I met the great Joan Parker, and I use a line about my wife Taylor that I'm sure Bob would have used about Joan. If she ever leaves me, I'm going with her. That's what I tell her all the time.
Love that. All righty. Well, anyway, to you, happy publication day.
Happy Thanksgiving, and it is always a joy to be. I'm honored to be a part of the Poison Pen family.
Thank you very much, Mike. Good night, everybody, and for all of you watching, enjoy your Thanksgiving as well. Bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.